Okay. So moving into the results, and essentially this is the beginning of the results section of our manuscript. So the first thing that we do is just give a general characterization of the literature that we found. I want to highlight again, even though I just mentioned how messy our conference room was, that we had very extensive piloting exercises, and I want to emphasize the importance of these, not only in determining, developing the process, but also in helping us find consistency and accuracy in our process for screening. So based on identification of papers, primarily from PubMed and Embase, and after removal of duplicates, our initial screening bucket was 5,706. Again, that was limited to searching between January 2001 and June 8, 2015, human studies only. After we went through the initial screening, which was done in Distiller SR, we went through quality control and committee reviews, et cetera. We excluded a fair number of these. Typically, these were excluded because outcomes were not relevant. So maybe, for example, an abstract said something about cardiovascular disease, but it never actually it looked at that. It was some sort of a contextual introduction or something of that nature. Unhealthy populations, co-exposures were a large source, so if there was, again, this exposure to other drugs or alcohol. Benefit studies that were clear benefit studies, and even though we had filters on in these databases, we still had some in vitro studies that made their way in. So then the experts reviewed based on title and abstract, and as we went through this phase where we then looked at the full text papers, so we had the full text in hand, and we actually screened the entire paper to again check for inclusion and exclusion. We had a number of additional of the hits that were excluded. At this point, the more common exclusion criteria was that there was not a quantitative estimate of exposure. So it might be that the paper looked at, in one of the analyses, a potential association or a yes-no, or of the 100 variables we looked at, here's ones with associations and not, but there was no quantitative estimate of exposure associated with an effect that we could use to compare to the comparator, essentially, that we could use to inform NAROT. We also included a number based on unhealthy populations here as well. So then once we got through the actual screening, and I will also mention that at the point that we did full text review, these were done on an outcome basis. So we had analysts within ToxStrategies that were assigned to a specific outcome. That allowed us to make sure that we had consistency in the people looking at them, and they were all looking at the same literature and seeing the same trends, et cetera. And then these analysts were then also responsible for looking at, for doing the extraction on these papers. And so you can see here we've shown on an outcome basis how many were excluded based on full text. And at the end, we reviewed 381 studies in our systematic review for our primary outcomes. Now, as we mentioned before, pharmacokinetics was somewhat of a different arm, a side arm, if you will, where we were obtaining information for contextual purposes. And so we found a number of studies, about 100, that made it through that we thought might advance the science. So again, these were not studies that were giving specific kinetic parameters, but more, did it characterize, for example, kinetics in a pregnant woman or in a child? We were trying to advance the science. And we found slightly under 50 that we thought did that. Now, the other thing is that a number of the outcome studies themselves also contained pharmacokinetic data. So, but they just got counted within the outcome. So in all, when we looked at all of the kinetic data, pharmacokinetic data, to try to interpret the outcomes, we had about 100 total that gave us information to do that. So with respect to the type of information that we found, shown on this slide is a simple pie graph showing the populations. As you can see, the majority of literature was in fact for adults, lesser amount for pregnant women, adolescents, and children. We did have some studies that might have included, for example, 18 and 19-year-olds as part of their assessment, but often this was, something like an age group of 18 to 25. And so we would look at this on a case-by-case basis, but in most cases that got classified as an adult. With respect to the exposure sources, we had about 40% were caffeine specific, followed by coffee, tea, and then other sources, so that might be energy drinks, coffee, chocolate, etc. It was notable that in the end, we needed to standardize fewer than 20% of the studies. So for greater, for the fair majority of studies, we were able to rely on the content, the caffeine content as reported by the authors. And exposure itself was measured in 63% of the studies versus self-reported in about 38%. And this tied very directly to the study type. As you can see, controlled trials, 63%. That's when we had controlled exposure. And essentially, in all of the other study types, it was something more like a self-report. So with respect to what you're going to hear over the remaining sessions in the morning is that each of our subject matter experts is going to discuss the characterizations of our literature, the syntheses by outcome. And so these all have a general structure. They contain information on the general characteristics. So how many studies were they? How many were included, excluded? What types of studies were they? What endpoints did they cover, etc. We then are going to walk through some of the endpoint characterizations. Now, in the manuscript, there are sections for every endpoint, so every endpoint we evaluated. And in that, you're going to get a summary of the individual studies, and we develop plots that accommodate these, which I'm going to speak more to in just a moment. Within the endpoint, we also talked about the body of evidence. We provided these risk of bias heat maps and talked about the confidence. And then again, in the outcome, we did something similar. We talked about the body of evidence, but we also talked about strengths and limitations with that evidence, as well as data gaps and research needs. And so that will be the format for each of the outcome assessments that you'll be hearing next. I do want to take a few minutes to talk through how we tried to visualize some of the information in the plots. As I mentioned earlier, we really wanted to, where we could, provide quantitative estimates, if you were, of these comparisons. So we created plots in order to try to show information from these studies relative to the comparator. And in order to develop these plots, we had to be selective, and this is where those values, example, the no L's and low L's came in, from these studies. These were selected based on the most refined result presented in that paper. And then in these plots, we really try to convey a lot of information. We're trying to use color and size and shape to capture all of this information on the type of effect, i.e. was there an effect or not, as well as the quality or the internal validity of the study. But I really also want to emphasize what these plots do not show. Starting just with the number of plots that we have, within the paper, there are a fair number of outcomes that have endpoints that had maybe only one data set or were a very unique endpoint. And so, for example, a plot wasn't developed for that. However, all of that information is in AHRQ. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that these plots very much do not show all of the data from every study. So while they are meant to be a quantitative comparison, it's important to know that there was information that is not in this plot that was considered in developing conclusions. So the structure of the plot is essentially along the x-axis we have the amount of caffeine consumed, and on the y we list individual studies. And then on each plot, we give the comparison, or the comparator value, which again came from NARAT. Oops. And then for each study, we have plotted this most refined value. Now, in some cases, there might be a couple. So, for example, if a study only gave results based on findings in males and females, we didn't select one over the other, we would plot two. So there's not an equal weighting, per se, as to the number of points that are on these plots. But again, it was the most refined. In this example, so we're showing the blue symbols are no effect levels, and the orange symbols are lowest effect levels. The data came in a variety of formats, and oftentimes we did not have discrete numbers. Sometimes we did if it was, for example, a single dose study in an RCT, or if the author specifically commented on, for example, a threshold associated with an effect. In many cases, we had studies, it's very common to do a dietary exposure survey and ask, again, I'll use coffee, how many cups of coffee do you drink a day? Less than 1 to 2, greater than 3. And that's the majority of the data that I would say that we had in many instances. And so in those types of situations, we would try to demonstrate the effect level with a greater than symbol. So for example, this could say no effect greater than, for example, 3 cups of coffee or something. And then in other cases, we only had effects associated with the range, and we didn't feel like it was appropriate to select a midpoint, whatnot. We reported it as the author reported it, so we would the effect in the given range or lack of effect in the given range. The other thing is that the size of the symbol represents where the study falls on the risk of bias. So the big ones essentially were associated with less risk of bias or more green, and the smaller symbols were more red or a higher risk of bias. So we're trying to convey quite a bit of information in this, but again, I'm going to emphasize this is not everything. For the risk of bias, just a reminder, each study was scored for a number of questions with 4 potential responses, and one of the figures that you will see in the next presentations for the outcomes are just pieces of these heat maps. Now it's not possible in the presentation to show you everything, but you'll see kind of a snippet just to remind you that when we thought about confidence, we were looking at these heat maps. And then again, just a reminder, as we were developing both by endpoint and outcome, which we don't have time to talk about every single one today, that we went through the exercise of developing both narrative discussions as well as a tabular summary of what our initial level of confidence was, moving through to our final level of confidence based on risk of bias, directness, magnitude, etc. And then my last set of slides here is talking about developing conclusions. So as we worked through to develop the conclusions, not only use a common narrative structure, it was important to us to be able to show this in a tabular format. This aims at being able to report our reporting structure and reporting more easily. So we did a weight of evidence table, and this is a piece of it. And so just moving from left to right, we've reported the number of points that we had for comparison, the range of values we had to look at. So again, thinking about these single values we picked from the study, which again is not everything. And then talking about, were there data to show if there were effects at intakes below or equal to the comparator? That would suggest that the comparator was too high. Similarly, were there lack of effects at or below the comparator? That would suggest that the comparator is acceptable. And then also, if there were a lack of effects above the comparator, in this last column, that might suggest that the comparator was too low. So then, in addition, we've used a color shading to depict what our conclusion was. So we're trying to give a simple visual to show where was the data and where's our conclusion. In determining that conclusion, of course, recall that we integrated the type of effect. Was it physiological? Was it reversible, et cetera? And then the importance in decision making. How important was this with respect to severity? And then, of course, our level of confidence. Given the example, I don't want to steal Dr. Weaver's thunder, so I'm just going to as you can see, just as filled out, you've got numbers, you've got X's, and you've got colors, and that will be described. I do want to say, though, that we very intentionally used a simple X versus trying to quantitate. We did not want to use the symbols from the plots as an accounting exercise because we felt like that oversimplified the analyses. One of the greatest utilities in this review is, of course, the lengths that we went to look at individual study quality, internal validity, external validity, and those can't be relayed entirely on those plots, nor can the context of those findings. And so each study, as we reported in the evidence tables, has a fair amount of data. And when we developed conclusions, we looked at all of that data. However, we also wanted to have simple reporting tools, so it's just an important concept to keep in mind when we're looking at the conclusions. And then, as Dr. Myers noted this morning, we have narrative conclusions with common structure and a simple conclusion column at the end of our table. And so essentially in the manuscript, this is small on purpose, this is basically all of our results from the manuscript developed on an endpoint basis and an outcome basis. And then at the end, we'll come back together to talk about, once we've gone through each outcome, what our overall conclusions, i.e. are the Narod et al. Conclusions supported.